I was hoping you were going to do it. Get all these buttons turned on. Travis, am I broadcasting? Okay. All right. Well, certainly glad to see. It looks like everybody made it back. Uh, I think Ray's getting ready to take a nap up there. He's one of the other fellows from Beelington. He's probably, someone said, it's too cold in here to nap. So we're glad that you've come back and haven't froze out. I heard someone say, boy, I'm glad it's not colder outside. So we're glad that you're here, and certainly from appreciate the kind comments and number one, your willingness to come, and hopefully we'll be able to share some things and talking with folks after the first sessions. It's absolutely true that God didn't answer every question that I have. He didn't explain every scientific principle. One of the Old Testament passages, and right off the top of my head I didn't research it, but the secret things belong to God. And so there are going to be things that we'll never be able to answer, and God said He did it. He said He created the world, and so we just have to realize that only certain things are going to be determinable. There are certainly, with the topic that we're going to cover next, that of the dinosaurs, there are probably as many questions in people's minds. And Thursday evening when I spoke on the phone to the news anchor, one of the things he brought up, well, now when did the dinosaurs go extinct? And so I ran through a lot of that with him, and we talked about that a little bit. But in everyone's mind, the topic of dinosaurs, is a big issue. The evolutionists believe that that solves the question about there being a creation. That certainly it's not possible for Giganosaurus, our cardboard friend over here, and that's not life size. Well, I guess it might have been as a baby, but that's not the adult size of Giganosaurus, but it's impossible for Giganosaurus and Adam and Eve to have lived on this earth at the same time. Well, you look at that mouthful of teeth. And so there are very legitimate questions. And, the dinosaurs became extinct 69 million years ago. And so in this session, we want to look at dinosaurs, I believe, undoubtedly are the greatest of God's creation in the animal kingdom. I believe being created in the image of God, as man was in Genesis chapter 1, verse 25, puts him in a little higher rank than the dinosaurs, who are just the chiefest of the ways of God. So we'll look at the question of dinosaurs. Are they mentioned in the Bible? How do they fit in terms with biblical time scales? And then in the second session this afternoon, we'll look at the flood of Noah. And we'll have to address, if indeed God created, the Brachiosaurus and Giganosaurus and Triceratops and the T-Rex, which I've got a juvenile T-Rex right here. If you'd like to look at those while I'm up here later on, come on up. I do try to stay close to them. I can't afford to replace them. They are very pricey. They're the same ones that are on display in all museums around the country, because there's only one juvenile Tyrannosaurus T-Rex skull. And so it's $7 million, and it's locked away in a vault somewhere. And every museum that displays a skull of that displays exactly what I've got. All right, they just can't have them all over the world at one time. So let's move into this topic of dinosaurs. And certainly, for me, it's always been a great fascination for me. I'm one of the few nutcases to have my own dinosaur. That is a Ketchiosaur, and I went on eBay and got into a bidding war with some people. I don't know where they're from, but there were several people wanting it, but I won the bid and got it relatively cheap because his neck is all messed up. You can see he's about 18 inches long. This is his head right here. And normally they would be, to have an ideal specimen, the head would be stretched out like this and not folded over. And that's why I was able to get him so cheap. So I'm one of those strange people that have my own dinosaurs. And of course, there's the juvenile T-Rex skull. and of course the Triceratops skull, which are on display up here. And I realize Warren back there can't see him very well. You know, he's afraid of the front rows. You know how preachers are. So, this topic is near and dear, certainly to my interest, and I hope that it'll be of some interest to you. Of course, we know that the biblical account says that God created all things. Revelation chapter 4, verse 11, and says they were created for the pleasure of God. And so certainly we need to look at then if God created all things, and if indeed these animals that we call dinosaurs, Gigantosaurus and Triceratops and T-Rex and all the other dinosaurs, if indeed they existed, then God created them. And that's the question then, where in the biblical account can we account for that? Well, we have to understand that translation of the Hebrew language into English, as it was done in 1611 by the King James translators, was a little bit problematic because they could only interpret things as much as they knew what they were referring to. And so in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, Moses recorded that God created great whales. Here's an example of a problem in the translation, because this word tamanin, which is again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so don't come up and try to get into a discussion about Hebrew context and language and so forth. But the people that are say that this word tamanin should be interpreted great monsters or sea serpents. All right, so verse 21 then, and God created great monsters, or God created sea serpents, would be a better translation than great whales. Now, you have to understand that in the days in 1611, the largest animal that probably the King James translators were familiar with in England would have been whales. They saw whales wash up on the shores of the beaches of England, and so they had been sketched, they had been observed, and probably some whaling had been done. So this was the biggest thing, and that they were familiar with. Those were huge. Those were monsters as far as they were concerned. And so the word tamanin, the question then, does that cover the dinosaurs? Then in verse 24 it says, and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind, and it was so. So, is it possible that it's in that, fairly nondescript concept of creeping thing? I mean, we don't know from the biblical account in Genesis 1 when an alligator was created, when a Komodo dragon was created, when a chameleon was created, but they would fall under certainly this idea of creeping thing and or beast of the earth as potential cover statements. Again, God couldn't go through and have Moses record, and I created, and I created, and I created. The book could have been too big to ever carry around. And so he simply had Moses record the general context of what was done. It's not a blow-by-blow account of each second of every minute of every creation of every item, organism that was there. So the question then, could the carnivores, like Gigantosaurus or Triceratops or the Plesiosaurus, can they and Adam and Eve have lived together? There's the verse in Revelation chapter 4, verse 11. Worthy art thou, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. And so, if God did create these animals, then certainly he was pleased with it. He was happy with what he had done. He knew what he was doing. And the question is then how we make those interpretations. East of the field, again, we can only guess at those scenes of the creation, the time periods after creation. We do have some indications, and we'll look at those in a minute. But when we look at National Geographic, is that tamanin? Is that the sea monster that the King James translators translated great whales? Is this what it is? That certainly would be a sea monster. If you're swimming and that thing's chasing you, I think he probably qualifies pretty well. And so when we get to the idea of the T-Rex and or the carnivores, any of the carnivorous dinosaurs, Deinonychus or whatever, whichever ones, is it impossible that they could have survived with humans, lived at the same time on the earth with humans? Because we know the creation, again, according to biblical interpretation, 6 literal, 24 hours a day, less than 10,000 years ago, more like 6 probably, giving best estimates. And so the question is it such an impossibility that these organisms could live with humans? Well, we look at a little more information here when we look at Genesis chapter 1, verses 29 and 30. Behold, I have given you, he's talking to Adam and Eve, every herb bearing seed, and later on, every tree, to you it shall be for meat. That means food. So God is telling Adam and Eve, here's what you're going to eat. You're going to use for food herbs and trees and fruits. And they were vegetarians, folks. All right? They were vegetarians. And then God continues, and to every beast of the earth. Wait a minute. That means everything was a vegetarian. According to these chapters, T-Rex, Giganosaurus, Brachiosaurus. We know many of the dinosaurs, of course, were herbivores. They ate plants, Seismosaur, and the one that used to be the Brontosaurus, which again, that was back from the Stone Age, because Brontosaurus was a misnomer. There was never such a creature, because what the geologists at the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh had done, when they were collecting dinosaur fossils, they found a head, they found a body, and they just assumed that the head went on the body. Well, it's about the right size, right shape, and it's of that type of dinosaurs. So they put it on and called it Brontosaurus. Only problem was that further later discoveries, they found the head on the body of another dinosaur. And so they had to go back. And so the dinosaur Brontosaurus never did exist. It was a conglomeration of 2 dinosaurs, because when we find dinosaur skeletons, 99% of the time, or most often, let's just put it that way, most often, the dinosaurs are found in bits and pieces. If you go to Dinosaur National Monument in Jensen, Utah, and look at that big wall of dinosaur bones, you'll see a head over here and tail pieces here and a leg up there, and they're just all jumbled up. And I asked when I was there, I asked the curator, one of the guides, well, how come they're not all laying together? Well, they were in a flood, was his answer. And I said, yeah, they were. But I didn't go into it any deeper, because there was about 4 or 5 dozen people standing waiting to talk with him as well. So the question then, is it possible that these animals ate, were they vegetarians? Is it possible that T-Rex could be a vegetarian? Well, the question of impossibility, we have to examine. Everyone knows what this is. Of course, that's a grizzly bear. Plant foods make up the majority of a bear's diet, sometimes as much as 90%. Now, if you look at that mouthful of teeth, and if you've ever seen the skull of a grizzly bear or even a black bear, the teeth are pretty formidable. I mean, it looks like it ought to be out there just running stuff down and mauling them away. And we know what happens when humans get caught with a black bear or a grizzly bear. The damage is very significant. And yet we see that, with that kind of carnivorous-looking teeth, 90% of a grizzly bear's diet is plant material. Bears, black bears, prefer plants to meat any day. And they would much rather have corn or berries or apples or fruits or something like that. And so not necessarily is it impossible for an animal, just because it has a mouthful of wicked-looking, meat-eating-looking teeth, that he is not capable of eating plants and getting nutrition out of it, especially if, again, is anything too hard for God, especially if God's involved. Well, let's look at some what I believe are very clear examples of dinosaurs in the Bible. And to do that, we have to turn to the book of Job. Job chapter 40, verses 15 through 24. God reveals to Job, and again, remember, this is in the time phase when God is answering Job, or asking Job questions. Actually, Job gets a science test. I'm not sure, I've had taken a lot of science tests in my life. I'm not sure I'd like to take a science test from God. I'm not sure, as Job found out, that he would ever come up with any right answers. And so in chapter 40, the book of Job, God says to Job, "Behold now Behemoth." Here's another one of those words. It's a word that was anglicized simply because the translators in the days of King James and the translators today don't have an answer for what that animal is. We don't know what behemoth is, what that animal represents. You know, the question that all we can do is start looking at descriptions, looking at what God said about this animal to get an idea of what it was. He goes on, behold now behemoth, and this is, I can imagine God saying to Job, look right out there, right over there, Job. Here, look at that animal. You know, I'm going to ask you about this animal. Look at him. You know, this was something that Job was familiar with. This was, Job, you remember looking in that science encyclopedia, that picture of that? No, this was an animal that Job was intimately familiar with. And of course, I believe that the book of Job may be the oldest of the books of the Bible. Again, I can't stick a pin in that. All I can say is that that's my opinion. Certainly the patriarchal dispensation, but I believe it may have been written before the time of Moses, but can't prove that. So that's just my opinion. But it says, which I made with thee. So God says, I made this animal with you, Job. He eateth grass as an ox. So we have an herbivore. We have a plant eater. Lo, now, his strength is in his loins, and the force is in the navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar, and the sinews of his stones are wrapped together. His bones are as strong pieces of brass. His bones are like bones of iron. And so whatever this animal is, this is quite a force to be reckoned with. This is a magnificent animal. He's obviously huge. The statement about, of course, the bones of iron and bars of brass, we know how that's what we build our large earth-moving equipment out of, and our biggest machines are made out of large pieces of metal. But the statement that God makes to Job about he moveth his tail like a cedar in verse 17 of chapter 40 is one that's very interesting, because in many concepts, in the terminology or in the time of the writing of any of the biblical books, the cedar trees that would have been known are the cedars of Lebanon. All right? These were the same trees that Solomon used in constructing the temple in Jerusalem. But this is a cedar of Lebanon. This picture I was able to take on one of my trips to England on one of the Blenheim Castle, the grounds of Blenheim Castle. And, of course, these were gifts from, Frank, the king of Jordan, back back several hundred years ago to the king of England, and had it planted here. You can see the relative size of the people. This is the cedars of Lebanon that Job probably would have been familiar with. A very large tree. And so when we look at the statement that he moveth his tail like a cedar, then we have to stop and ask. In the margin of many Bibles, the translators will say, well, this behemoth is a hippopotamus, a water horse. And he fits some of the descriptions. He's a plant eater. He loves water. He can take up, he can swim in the rivers. Or it's an elephant. And yet when we look at the tails on these animals, the question is, does that fit God's description of he moveth his tail like a cedar? Well, you can see the tail on an elephant. You might call it a cedar switch. I'm not sure it would be a cedar tree by any stretch of the imagination. Or look at the hippopotamus tail. It's even shorter and smaller and stubbier than the tail on the elephant. And so the question is, do these fit in any way the bill? And I don't believe in that regard alone, nor in the facts that these animals, the behemoth was the chief of the ways of God. He was a huge creature which man would have trouble dealing with. And we know that humans have captured and killed and eaten and herded elephants and hippopotamuses. While they're dangerous animals, they can be mastered by humans. They can be trapped, they can be snared, they can be killed. And so they would not, in my opinion, fit the bill in that regard, but also in the fact that their tails do not certainly fit as being described. The chief of the ways of God, verse 19 says, he that made him can make his sword approach to him. So, the one that's going to be able to kill this animal is going to be the one who made him. And certainly when you look at something like the seismosaur that is depicted here, that animal, you look at the tail, certainly, much more tree-like than The tail of an elephant plus the enormous size of this animal certainly would fit the bill as being the chiefest of the ways of God as opposed to an elephant or a hippopotamus. Surely the mountains bring him forth food where all the beasts of the field play. He lieth under the shady trees in the covert of the reeds and the ferns. The shady trees cover him with their shadow, and their willows of the brook compass him about. Behold, he drinketh up a river, and hasteneth not. He trusteth that he can draw Jordan into his mouth. Whatever this animal was, he was comfortable in the water. He was very much in the ability to wade in and out of large bodies of water, and of course, we can imagine that these large dinosaurs would have been more than capable of such an ability. So, is this what Behemoth was? Well, it's a good question. Then in chapter 41, the entire chapter deals with something called Leviathan. And if we start reading the description of Leviathan in verse 14, who can open the doors of his face? His teeth are terrible round about. His scales are his pride, shut up together as a close seal. One is so near to the other that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and they cannot be sundered. By his sneezings a light doth shine, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Obviously, this animal is a reptile. From the description of Behemoth, we can't be absolutely positive that it was a reptile. It was an herbivore, and that's about all we can say. This animal very clearly is reptilian. It's got scales like a snake, like a lizard. It obviously had scales. But when it gets down to verse 18, 19, where it talks about his, by his sneezings a light does shine forth, and his eyes were like the eyelids of the morning. Is this what Job was being described to Job? Well, we don't know, but we continue. Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils go smoke as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. Verses 19 through 21. Now, I don't know about you, but I can come up with a fairly clear image in my mind of what this animal was, and it's a fire-breathing dragon. All right? Now, is it possible for fire-breathing dragons to have ever lived? Well, therein lies the catch. All right? Certainly we know in mythology they did, and so is it totally impossible that there could have been a creature that could have breathed fire, a reptile animal that was capable of breathing fire? Well, it may not be so hard to believe as you might imagine, because if you had never seen a fish like this, an animal like this, that could run this computer and that data projector and these lights all the time simply by generating electricity out of his body. If I was to describe, if you had never heard of an electric eel, if you did not know what an electric eel was, and I've had the privilege of actually watching them cause an electric eel to discharge its electricity up at the Pittsburgh Zoo twice a day, they will go into their electric eel tank, and they have a plastic rod. I wonder why they don't use metal. But anyway, they have a long plastic rod, and they will gently poke the side of that eel. And when they do, they've got two electrodes down in the tank. And when the fish discharges, the electricity goes through a series of light bulbs. And then it has a little sound generator. And those lights, all 12 of them, will light up. And he'll keep them lit. And as long as he's upset, he can discharge enough electricity to do that. So now if you were to imagine an animal that's capable of, why do we need coal-fired power plants? Just gives a bunch of electric eels. They'll come up to your house, your toaster and your microwave oven. But it would be, like I said, if we did not know of these things, if someone tried to describe. Well, would you believe it if you'd never seen or heard about the bombardier beetle? Bombardier beetle is a tremendous little critter, about a half-inch long. Lives mainly in Europe, although there are some representatives in America, but very few and far between. The bombardier beetle is capable of a defensive mechanism that is really pretty cool stuff, because at the back end of its body it has a nozzle, basically, an aimable nozzle. He can control where the nozzle is pointing, and when he's about to be attacked, you can see here by an ant or by a frog or some other predator, he's capable of firing a blast of super hot, 212 degrees, boiling water. Actually, it's a noxious mixture of not just water, but it has some other chemicals. because he's capable of taking two inert chemicals, hydrogen peroxide and hydroquinone, keeping them in chambers so they do not mix with one another, and squirts them in at the time he's about to be attacked. But if he did not squirt in an anti-inhibitor at the same time, he would blow himself up. So what he has to do is has to put the two chemicals in, squirt in the anti-inhibitor so that they don't blow up until he's absolutely ready, and then he's got specialized combustion tubes, just like an explosion chamber, and at the time he's ready to discharge it, he puts in the anti-inhibitor, and boom, out comes. If you were to pick one of these up, and they're only about a half-inch long, if you were to pick them up, it would the pain that would cause would be like picking up taking a match, a farmer's match, blowing it out, and grabbing the head of the match while it's still glowing. You will get a burn just that serious. So the question is, would you have believed that such a critter was possible if I hadn't just described one to you? The bombardier beetle is an amazing animal, and it's being studied for everything from fire extinguisher nozzles to jet airplanes engines. I mean, it's going to revolutionize a lot of things, and there are literally thousands of study or researchers working on the bombardier beetle right now. But what about if I described to you an organism that was capable of producing heat or light without heat? You know, fireflies. They produce light using bioluminescence. And I'd say all of us probably have, most cultures from around the world have myths and legends about great beasts or great dragons. All legends have some basis in truth. Now that doesn't mean that everything about every legend is true, because we know humans are great exaggerators. And you take a little bit of truth and you expand on it and you make it bigger than it was before. Just talk about your fishing trips or your hunting trips. They call ground shrinkages, you know, how big the horns were on the buck, you know, until he's on the ground, then he shrinks, okay? They're not as big as they were when he was running through the woods. Many of the legends have diagrams and pictures to back them up, and reports still exist of the sightings of things that, you know, we're not sure what they are or if they are, but there are still reports coming on. Then we have some historical reference here, a English bishop by the name of Richard Bell, 15th century bishop in the Church of England, a great outdoorsman and hunter. There is a cathedral in northern England, Carlisle, where his tomb is laid out in the aisle. His actual body is buried in this cathedral in the center aisle. Around the tomb is a brass inlay. Okay, it's called a frieze. And in that they've got sketches of the animals that he was supposed to have hunted or killed or captured in his life. And this year was the time when he lived was in 1496. Now keep that in mind, because the animals that we see are, you know, a lot of them are, and remember the dinosaur skeletons weren't discovered until the 1800s. There's the tomb, there's the brass frieze around the outside, you can see going down through here. And then if you look at some of the animals on the frieze, okay? Some of them we might recognize, wolves or birds. We might recognize some of them as, you know, that looks like a bear or something to that effect. You know, fish. So, you know, and then we have something like this. Exactly what this animal is sort of defies, you know, explanation. You obviously have, you know, apparently this is the tail, or, you know, looks like the two heads are sort of fighting up here. Large bodies, long tails. You know, question is, what was that animal? Remember, this had to be an animal that Richard Bell hunted or saw in his exploits. Well, what about this one? And this one, the picture isn't really great, but there are actually horns, almost like the Triceratops horns on this creature. So is it possible that Richard Bell actually hunted or, you know, some of these animals, some of these what appear to be dinosaur animals? Very interesting. Then we have the Inca burial stones from the country of Peru. And there are thousands of these Inca burial stones. But there's about, I think, 400 or 500 that actually have drawings, sketches. And these were done, the Inca burial stones are done by taking smooth volcanic rocks out of the rivers and then sketching in them. By scratching on them, you can actually make impressions, and where they scratch off becomes lighter. But if you look at some of the animals, anyone make out what this dude is right here? Well, isn't that Triceratops? You know, you see the horns coming out. You got a small horn here, just like right there. Okay, you got this large shield, just like that. Come up here. Anyone recognize this dinosaur? Where's our kids that are dinosaur fans? Stegosaurus, absolutely, young man. Give that boy the prize. Okay, over here looks like a what? Something like a seismosaur or a brachiosaur or something like that. And so we can see several different possible dinosaurs on those. Here we go. Here's another one. Look at this one. What's the dinosaur? Triceratops, right? Obviously got 3 horns up there. Obviously has a shield on its head. Again, they're a little bit stylized. In other words, they're not 100% anatomical representations, but they're pretty close. But it could also be Stegosaur because what's he got on his back? He's got a row of plates or shields. So again, we're not sure. But what do we also have happening there? Who or what is that? Like I had a dude smoking a peace pipe up there. Okay? There's a man on top of that. Okay. Now remember, evolution says that how many years separated human evolution appearance on Earth and the disappearance of the dinosaurs? 69 million years. Okay? Now remember, are these Inca Indians, are they creationists? Are they trying to make these things to fool everybody into believing that dinosaurs and man lived at the same time? No, they date these things, and every other Inca burial stone that does not have dinosaurs on it, that has something, a natural scene or something like that, they're accepted as legitimate. Even though they come out of the same tombs, come out of the same area, and are geologically dated by their methods at the same age as the other ones, because they contain representations of, obviously, dinosaurs, the evolutionists will not accept it. This one looks like what? Come on, who is that? Couldn't that be Giganosaur? Easily could be, or certainly T-Rex. And what's happening here? What's that? Got obviously. Oh, there's another one back here. I think the poor human's outnumbered, isn't he? It's like a 2-to-1 tag team. And what's the hunter have? He's got a knife up there, doesn't he? He's trying to defend himself. Now, is that how did these Inca Indians come up with? Oh, that guy didn't fare so well either, did he? Looks like he's already lunch, okay? And that was supposed to be a plant eater. But anyway, so the question is, how do these Indians make these kind of drawings if they had not actually seen the animals? Well, there's an entire battle going on between obviously a dinosaur and a bunch of Inca Indians. So certainly some very interesting situations. Again, myths and legends always have some basis in truth. Marco Polo is described as the man of a million lies because when he went to the Far East and came back and told stories of things he had seen and things he had brought back, people said, there's no way that can be true. He described a black rock that the Chinese had that would burn. And the people said, there's no such rocks that you can set on fire and burn. Of course, Marco Polo had seen coal. And so stories like that. But Marco Polo described on one of his entrances into one of the royal cities in the Chinese that the emperor was drawn in was riding in a chariot drawn by a 3-horned beast. Okay, now stop and think about it. Think of all the animals in the world today, and come up with any animal that could be described as a 3-horned beast. Now, did Marco Polo see the emperor of China being pulled by a chariot with a triceratops in front of it? I don't know. It wasn't there. Okay? But it certainly seems that Marco Polo, saw something, and his descriptions of coal and of fireworks and of this and that, everything else has been confirmed. So why not this report of a 3-horned beast? Of course, the fire-breathing dragons and the fights with the Knights of the Round Table, again, while we know that there was obviously lots of exaggerations, probably not all of it was exaggerated. And of course, even in the American Southwest, this is a drawing, a cave drawing, etching from Arizona. And, what kind of an animal is that? Something that could stand up on its hind legs or with a long tail. It's not anything that we've got running around the Southwest, American Southwest today. So very interesting. Then, of course, you go to England, and in the museums over there, they have all kinds. This is tapestry from the 11th century of St. George slaying the dragon. And in that case, and they have sculptures of it, and they have paintings of it, and they have, again, the tapestries of it. And in some cases, they are fire-breathing dragons. Now, again, were they able to, before, in the 11th century, before any dinosaur skeleton had ever been dug up, were they able to come up with, imagine, out of their imagination, in this case, it was not only a dragon, but a flying dragon. All right? Well, of course, we don't know. But it certainly gives some indication. Then we go to Mexico with the figurines that have been uncovered and many of them under foundations of houses that had been built. Well, you can see that these are clay figurines. And if you look at them, where's our dinosaur expert back there? Yeah, what is that? Ever heard of ankylosaur? Oh, yeah, the great big thing on his tail that he swung around and whacked people on the head with. Whacked things on the head with. Okay, yeah. Is this something like a brachiosaur or something, stegosaur, right? Here's another of those examples. How did ancient Mexicans, dated from 12, 13 AD, how did they, create an animal that, maybe it's an alligator. Obviously, what's the alligator doing if that's what it is? He's obviously in a battle with a biped, a human. And so the question is, had these Mexicans actually seen dinosaurs and had encounters with them? Really good question. From Indonesia, Cambodian temple, that you can see this animal here. Again, noticing the plates down the back. And, again, certainly looks a lot like a stegosaur. Again, we just don't know, but this is from 1180 AD. All right? So all of this evidence just keeps adding up and adding up and adding up. If indeed these people saw these animals, saw these dinosaurs, then means that, and how do you come up with a drawing if you've not seen the actual animal? How do you come up with a diagram? Well, we're also finding in modern science that the question about whether or not the dinosaurs died off 69 million years ago is being called into some serious question because of what we're finding. Dinosaur veins found inside a fossil. Soft tissue from 80-million-year-old hadrosaur is spotted in remains found in Montana. Folks, what they're finding now in multiple places, and I got a couple other pictures. This happened to be recorded in the Daily Mail from the UK. But they're finding blood vessels, live or healthy blood tissue, red blood cells, blood vessels that have the DNA in them. They're to the point now where basically we could take the DNA out of some of these supposedly 80-million-year-old fossils and clone them. It's not that far away, from reality when we're getting live, fresh tissue like this. A medical pathologist examined the dinosaur bone under a microscope and found dinosaur blood. Those are red blood cells inside the bone. That was from June 1997. This is from a T-Rex. This is fresh connective tissue. Now, connective tissue is what holds muscle, bone to muscle, or muscle to muscle. All right? And so this is from a T-Rex that we're finding fresh tissue. And the question comes up, how can fresh tissue survive 69, 80 million years fossilization in the ground? Well, obviously, it's not likely. 2006, here's some more pictures of fresh tissue, blood vessels, bones, and the osteocytes are the same bone-developing cells that we have in our long bones of our body. And so over and over again now we're finding these kinds of things. Well, then here's this case, and Eddie's giving me a 5 sign. He wasn't doing me a high five. That was you got 5, son. Finish it up. All right. The question about what this animal is. This animal was pulled up in the nets of a Japanese fishing trawler back in early 70s, 68, 69, somewhere in there, around that time period. But they pulled this. They were a trawler. They're dragging their nets through the Pacific Ocean, and when they pull it out, they have this embedded in the nets. A large, rotting mass of something. Stunk to high heaven, I can imagine. I wasn't there. but I can imagine it was a very odorous situation. The question is, and you can see that this is sort of looking this back, there's the backbone there, and you can see what appears to be, that's the long neck draping down, and this is one of the flipper-like fins. And some scientists say, well, that's just a basking shark, one of the large sharks that, decomposing and could decompose into that fashion. But look at this. They had an onboard, I can't say it. We need to quit. I'm out of talk, too. They had a biologist. They had someone who could draw pictures. How's that? And this is what he drew of what he saw. All right? Now, if that doesn't look much more, like a plesiosaur than a basking shark, and this was a trained biologist. This wasn't somebody who was just a fisherman who liked to draw pictures. All right? So did these, and the crazy thing was that they had a load of fish. They knew the value of the fish, and the captain said, okay, guys, we pulled the crew together. We can keep this. We can put it in our refrigerated holds, and we can keep it, but it may totally ruin the value of the catch that we have. So, and of course, each sailor, each fisherman got a part of the catch, so they knew that they already had, $10,000 in their bank account if they kept the fish. Where if they kept this thing, they may not have anything because they ruined the fish because they threw this in on top of the fish. And so they opted to throw the thing overboard, which is why the biologist did the sketches so detailed. And, of course, did they throw away the rotting carcass of a plesiosaur? Of course, we'll never know at this point. But examples like this, and of course the word dinosaur, as you may or may not know, means terrible lizard. Now, if you've been to Florida or to any zoo where they have a saltwater crocodile that will measure 20 feet in length, and that's a long ways, especially if you're in front of him and he's chasing you. Is that a terrible lizard? Is that a dinosaur? No. Those aren't dinosaurs. They're still alive today. Got news for you. I'll tell you one more story and then I'll quit maybe. Warren's back there saying, oh, come on, you got to quit. You got to give time for questions. Went to the Smithsonian. Again, remember the friend with keys? We went several times. When you've got someone with keys to the Smithsonian, you go fairly often. So we went one time and went into the paleontology division where they had this huge rock. I mean, huge rock. Probably as thick as these chairs and maybe 4 or 5 rows. Great big chunk of rock. They had brought in there and they had, you could see they had, there was a man laying up on the rock with dental drills and he was digging or he was excavating, taking the bones out, cutting the rock away from the bones. And when we walked in, the friend that was, he said, hey, Fred, how about getting off there and taking a break and telling us what you're doing? So he got off and stretched a little bit, and he started showing us the dinosaurs that he was taking out. He had 3 dinosaurs in there. He said, I'm currently working on, and he rattled off some scientific name, didn't mean a thing to me. But I said, that looks like an alligator. And I said, how similar? He says, yeah, that's basically what it is. I said, how similar is it to the modern alligator or crocodiles? He said, if he's alive today, he probably wouldn't know the difference. Looks the same. Said there's going to be some minor details. There's going to be some things that you might notice, and that this is an extinct. But here we had, and obviously an alligator, crocodile, much like this one. The only reason, why aren't those dinosaurs today? They didn't go extinct. They only made one mistake. They didn't go extinct. If they had went extinct, absolutely guaranteed, they would be dinosaurs. Well, what about the Komodo dragon? Is that a terrible lizard? Yeah, they'll go 10, 12 feet and they eat buffaloes, water buffaloes for lunch. And they run them down. Actually, they can't kill and eat them. They don't have to. All they have to do is just get one scratch. One scratch, and then they follow the animal as it dies because of the bacterial infection that it introduces into its bloodstream. And then it just waits till it doesn't want to have to fight this animal, but it doesn't have to. Okay? He's smarter than that. So the Komodo dragon, certainly, and I've seen them at the San Diego Zoo, standing up there about, just about thigh height on me and 8, 10 feet long, and that's a terrible lizard. Remember, most dinosaurs are about the same size as my Ketchiosaur, about 18 inches long. Most dinosaurs were not the Giganosaur of 22 feet or the large sauropods, the Brachiosaur, and those 150, 200-foot long animals. They are small. Most dinosaurs were chicken-sized. All right? So, again, we like to fantasize about these great big monsters, but they weren't always the same. Well, in my opinion, Hollywood got it right, okay, because they had Fred Flintstone working on, that's a brontosaurus, by the way, that doesn't exist, but that was a brontosaurus. And so are there any questions? Now, Warren, I'm done. I'll take some questions. Anyone have any questions about the dinosaurs? And where's our guy holding the mic? Anyone? Oh, no, I'm just going to give him a chance to get started so we don't run out of time. Yes, sir. Yeah, I got a big one. Yeah, that's size 13 there. Yeah, I got Bigfoot. What about Bigfoot? Well, first thing we know, he's not a dinosaur. Okay? If he exists, he's some sort of mammalian creature, and who knows? I mean, you stop and think about, and I did not mention in the discussion, are there a lot of animals that have descriptions that people report to have seen that maybe fit things that we don't know about today? There's what's it, Ogopogo or something out in Seattle, Washington. Some sort of creature that's supposed to live in one of the bays out there. Molo Mbembe, which is in South America. And in order to get an idea of what they think this thing was, paleontologists took pictures. They took elephant, they took hippopotamus, and then took diagrams of large dinosaurs like the sauropods, and took them in, and then they had 12 people that said, I've seen it, I've seen it. They brought them into a room one at a time, laid the pictures out on the table and said, pick out the animal you saw. They point to it, they send him out that door, bring the next man in. Point to it, they point to it, send him out that door. So they can't do what? Hey guys, we're all picking number D. Okay? Each one of them picked an animal that looked like a brachiosaur or something on that order. Now these are humans, natives that are alive today in South America. And they say they have seen this thing. Now, how do you discount eyewitness reports? Well, obviously evolutionists do, because they can't do that. You can't have dinosaurs and people living at the same time. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, I get wound up. Yeah. At what point did they all go extinct, or those die out? I think there's a lot of answers. Part of it's going to be in the next discussion on the flood, because I believe that you have to understand that Genesis chapter 9, verses 1, 2, and 3, God, remember in Genesis chapter 1, at the end of 29 and 30, God said, you and the beasts are going to eat plants and herbs and trees. Then in chapter 9, God says, now the fear of you and the dread of you is going to be on the animals. They're going to fear you. You're going to be allowed to eat them for food. Okay? So at that point, I'm thoroughly convinced that Fred Flintstone sat with his feet